You know that feeling when you've done everything right and it still doesn't work? You followed the plan, put in the hours, and used every technique you know. And when the sun comes up, you've got nothing to show for it. That's not a metaphor. That's a Tuesday night on the Sea of Galilee. Around AD 28, a fisherman named Simon is standing knee-deep in water, scrubbing the slime out of an empty net. He is thinking about how he's going to explain to his family that the lake gave him nothing tonight. Here's what makes this story fascinating. The most important catch in the Bible doesn't come from skill, timing, or effort. It comes from the one moment a professional stops trusting his expertise and bets everything on a single sentence. That sentence comes from someone who, by all rights, should know nothing about fishing. And what happens next doesn't just fill a boat. It rewrites Simon's entire life. The empty net was never the problem. It was the prerequisite. To understand what's happening in Luke chapter 5, you need to know what fishing on the Sea of Galilee looked like in the first century. This was not recreational. This was an industry, the Sea of Galilee, also called Lake Gennesaret or Kinneret, a name meaning harp because of the lake's shape. It was the economic engine of the entire region. The fishing trade there was so profitable that the ruling tetrarchs invested heavily in its infrastructure. Fishermen paid annual taxes per boat and per catch. This was serious commercial work. Peter and his partners were not hobbyists. They owned boats and employed hired workers. They ran a business that fed families and funded communities. The tool of their trade was the trammel net, a remarkable piece of engineering. Picture 3 layers of netting stitched together along a single head rope and foot rope. The 2 outer layers had wide mesh, and the inner layer had tight mesh and hung loose between the outer walls. When a fish swam through the first outer wall, it hit the loose inner net. The fish pushed the loose inner net through the far outer wall, creating a pocket that trapped it. It was ingenious. But here's the critical detail. These nets were made of linen. During the day, fish could see them and swim right around them, so trammel net fishing was done exclusively at night. A crew of 4 or 5 men would row out after dark and lay the net parallel to the shore. Then they would use a second boat to splash and bang oars, driving the fish toward the net. They'd repeat this process as many as 12 times in a single night. And when morning came, the fish were sorted. The nets were washed to prevent the linen from rotting, and the whole system was hung to dry and folded for the next run. So when Luke tells us that Simon and his partners had toiled all night and caught nothing, this is not one failed attempt. This is an entire shift. Hours upon hours of rowing, laying, splashing, hauling, resetting, and hauling again. Every technique was deployed, and every trick in the book was tried. But the nets came up empty every single time. Now, the Greek word Luke uses for toiled is kopiaō, and this word doesn't just mean worked. It comes from the root kopos, which means exhausting labor, the kind of effort that leaves you physically spent. It carries the idea of being beaten down by fatigue. It's the same word Jesus uses in Matthew 11:28 when he says, "Come to me, all you who labor and are weary and heavy laden." Luke is painting a picture. These are not men who tried and gave up. These are men who poured out everything they had and were left depleted, empty-handed, and aching. They didn't just fail, they were exhausted by the failure. That's a different thing entirely, and it's right here in the middle of that exhaustion that Jesus shows up. But he doesn't show up to fish. He shows up to teach. Luke tells us that the crowd was pressing in on him, so tightly pushing against him to hear the word of God. Jesus needed space, so he stepped into Simon's boat, the one sitting idle with its empty nets. He asked Simon to push out a little from shore, and then Jesus sat down and taught the multitudes from the boat. Think about that for a second. Jesus doesn't commandeer a successful operation. He borrows the boat of a man who just failed. The empty boat becomes the pulpit. That's not an accident. Luke is already showing us something about how God works. He doesn't wait for you to have it all together. He steps into the middle of your worst night and starts speaking from right there. But what comes next is where the whole story turns. After Jesus finishes teaching, he looks at Simon and says something that, to a professional fisherman, sounds almost absurd. Launch out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch, Luke 5-4. It's the middle of the day now. The sun is up. The fish have retreated to deeper, cooler water where no predator can see them. And the nets, those linen nets, are now fully visible in the bright water. Everything about this command contradicts Simon's lifetime of experience. A carpenter is telling a fisherman how to fish at the worst possible time, using a technique that only works in the dark. And here's where the Greek gets really interesting. Simon's response uses a word that only Luke uses in the entire New Testament, epistatēs. English Bibles translate it master, but that flattens it in classical Greek. This word was used for military commanders, government overseers, even the president of the Athenian assembly. It literally comes from two roots, epi, meaning over, and a form of histemi, meaning to stand. So an epistatēs is someone who stands over someone with authority to give orders. Luke uses this word instead of rabbi because he's writing for a Greek-speaking audience, but the choice reveals something deeper. Simon doesn't call Jesus teacher, he calls him commander. And then he does something extraordinary. Epistatēs, Simon says, we have toiled all night and caught nothing. Nevertheless, at your rhēma, I will let down the nets. Luke 5:5. That word, rhēma, is one of two primary Greek words translated word in the New Testament. Logos tends to refer to the broad, written, enduring word of God, the complete message, but rhēma is different. Rhēma is an utterance, a specific spoken word directed at a specific moment. It's the word Luke uses when the angel speaks to Mary, and she responds, "Let it be to me according to your will," Luke 1:38. It's the word used when Simeon, holding the infant Jesus, says, "Now you are dismissing your servant according to your will," Luke 2:29. Every time rhēma appears in Luke's gospel, it marks a moment where someone receives a direct, personal word from God, and they have to decide whether to act on it. So Simon isn't saying, "Well, you're the teacher, so I'll give it a try." He's saying, "Everything I know tells me this won't work. But on the basis of your specific personal spoken word to me right now, I'll do it." That's not casual obedience. That's a man choosing to override his own expertise with trust in a voice he barely knows. And the nets go down in broad daylight, in the wrong conditions, against every principle of the trade. And then the text says they enclosed a great number of fish, and their nets were breaking, Luke 5-6. The Greek word Luke uses for enclosed is synkleo, and it has the prefix syn, meaning together, intensifying the verb. It suggests surrounding, completely closing in from every side. This isn't a good catch. This is an overwhelming, net-destroying, boat-sinking haul. Simon signals to his partners in the other boat, and they come and fill both boats so full that they begin to go under. Mendel Nunn was a fishing scholar who spent over 20 years fishing the Sea of Galilee. Using the same ancient techniques from before modern nets existed, he devoted his life to studying these exact methods. Based on what we know about trammel net capacity and the text description of two boats, they were nearly sinking under the weight. Scholars estimate this was an extraordinary haul, far beyond what a crew would normally catch in an entire week of good fishing. It happened in one cast in the middle of the day, when everything said it couldn't be done. If you're watching this and this resonates with you, if you've ever felt you did everything right and still came up empty, you're not alone. And you might want to stick around, because what happens to Simon next changes everything. Maybe you know what that feels like. A woman named Joelle sits in her car in the parking lot of a restaurant where she's worked for 6 years. She was just passed over for a promotion she was overqualified for again. She stares at her hands on the steering wheel and thinks about all the nights she stayed late. She also thinks about all the systems she built and all the problems she solved that nobody noticed. She's good at her job, she knows she's good at her job. And the emptiness of the recognition she keeps chasing is starting to feel less like a rough patch and more like a verdict. "Maybe I'm just not enough," she says to nobody. We'll come back to Joelle, but her story and Simon's have more in common than you'd think. Now, here's what's fascinating about Peter's reaction. He doesn't celebrate, he doesn't pump his fist, he doesn't count the fish. He falls down at Jesus' knees and says, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." Luke 5. In verse 8, notice he doesn't call Jesus epistatēs anymore. The word shifts to kurios, Lord. Something has fundamentally changed in how Simon sees the man sitting in his boat. Why would a miraculous catch of fish make someone feel sinful? Because of where the miracle happened. This wasn't a healing in a synagogue. This wasn't an exorcism in a public square. This was Simon's domain, and fishing was the one thing he knew better than anyone. Jesus just demonstrated authority over the one area of life where Simon was the expert. When divine power shows up in your field, in the space where you thought you had it figured out, it doesn't just impress you, it exposes you. Simon suddenly sees the distance between what he can do and what God can do, and it terrifies him. This is the same pattern you find all the way back in Isaiah 6. When Isaiah sees the Lord high and lifted up in the temple, his first response isn't worship. It's woe is me, for I am undone. Isaiah 6-5. There's something about a genuine encounter with divine holiness that makes human confidence collapse. This is not because God is trying to shame anyone, but because the light is so bright that every shadow becomes visible. The Greek grammar of Jesus' response carries something beautiful. When Jesus says, "Do not be afraid" in Luke 5:10, the construction literally means, stop being fearful. It's calming an existing fear, not preventing a future one. Simon is already trembling, and Jesus speaks directly into that fear, not with a rebuke but with reassurance. God doesn't expose your inadequacy to leave you there. He exposes it so he can replace it with something you never could have manufactured on your own. A woman named Joelle sits in her car in the parking lot of a restaurant where she's worked for 6 years. She just got passed over for a promotion she was overqualified for again. She stares at her hands on the steering wheel and thinks about all the nights she stayed late. She thinks about all the systems she built and all the problems she solved that nobody noticed. She's good at her job, and she knows she's good at her job. And the emptiness of the recognition she keeps chasing is starting to feel less like a rough patch and more like a verdict. Maybe I'm just not enough, she says to nobody. What Joelle doesn't know yet is that the empty net was never the final chapter. It was the page before the page that changes everything, because look at what Jesus says to Simon after the catch. Do not be afraid, from now on you will be catching people alive. Luke 5:10. That phrase, catching alive, is a single Greek word, zoegio. It only appears twice in the entire New Testament, here and in 2 Timothy 2:26. It's built from two roots, zoe, meaning life, and agreo, meaning to catch or to hunt. In classical Greek, it was a military term for taking prisoners of war alive rather than killing them. In Homer's Iliad, it describes sparing an enemy on the battlefield. But in 2 Timothy, Paul uses it to describe people being held captive by the enemy and needing to be set free. So when Jesus says Simon will zogrio people, there's a deliberate tension in the word. You're going to capture people, yes, but you're going to capture them into life, not death. You're going to pull them out of the water, not to destroy them, but to save them. This is the exact opposite of what happens to fish. A fisherman catches fish alive and they die, but a fisher of people catches people who are, in a sense, drowning and gives them life. The word itself contains the gospel in miniature. Jesus delivers this commission to a man who, 10 minutes ago, was washing empty nets and questioning whether he was any good at his job. Notice the structure Luke has built. Simon begins the story as an epistatēs fisherman, someone with authority in his domain. He ends the story responding to a new epistatēs, a true commander, and receiving a completely new vocation. The word that began as a professional title, Master, we toiled all night, becomes a confession of faith. The empty net becomes the door to a full life. The man who was depleted by failure is now deployed for a mission bigger than anything he could have imagined. This isn't just a one-time event. Luke is building a structure that spans the entire biblical narrative. In John chapter 21, after the resurrection, we find almost the exact same scene. The disciples have gone back to fishing. Peter is leading the expedition. They fish all night and catch nothing. A figure on the shore tells them to cast their nets on the other side, and they haul in 153 large fish. Peter, recognizing the Lord, throws himself into the water and swims to shore. But here's what's different. In Luke 5, when Peter recognizes who Jesus is, he says, "Depart from me." In John 21, when Peter recognizes who Jesus is, he jumps into the water to get to him as fast as possible. Between those two miraculous catches of fish stands the entire ministry of Jesus, the cross and the resurrection. And after Peter's own devastating failure of denying Jesus 3 times, the man who once said, "Go away," now says, "I'm coming." The empty net is the same. The response is transformed. Failure didn't disqualify Peter. It deepened his hunger for the one who had already proven the empty net was never the end of the story. And in John 21, the net doesn't break. In Luke 5, the nets were tearing apart. But in John 21, there are 153 large fish, and the net holds. It's as if John is saying, the mission that begins in weakness and tearing will, in the end, hold. The kingdom net is strong enough for the catch. What God starts in your most exhausted, most inadequate moment, he finishes with a net that doesn't tear. So what do we carry out of this boat? Here's the thing about the empty net. It was part of the design. Simon's failure wasn't a detour. It was the setup. If the nets had been full that night, Peter would have had no reason to listen to a carpenter's fishing advice. The emptiness created the space for the encounter when you've exhausted your own resources, your own strategies. When you have your own late nights of effort and come up with nothing, that's not God abandoning you. That may be God clearing the deck so you can hear a rhēma, a specific personal word. You'd never have listened to that if things had gone according to your plan. The question isn't, why is the net empty? But what is God about to say into this space? And then there's the shift from epistatēs to kopiaō. Simon started by calling Jesus commander, a title of professional respect, but he ended by calling him Lord, a title of personal surrender. That shift didn't happen through a sermon or a theological argument. It happened when Jesus demonstrated authority in the one area where Simon thought he didn't need help. Most of us have that area, the thing we're confident we figured out, the domain where we don't think we need God's input. Relationships, career, finances, parenting, and it's often precisely there, in the place of our greatest competence, that Jesus says, "Let me into the deep." The invitation isn't to abandon your expertise. It's to let it be redirected by someone who sees what the night shift can't. Remember Joelle in the parking lot. She eventually walks back into the restaurant, not because the promotion comes through. It doesn't. She walks in because something shifts in how she sees the empty net. She stops asking, "Why isn't this working?" and starts asking, "What am I being freed for?" It takes months. It's not a clean story. But the day comes when she applies for a completely different position at a nonprofit she's never heard of. Something in her gut tells her this is the rhēma moment. And the nets hold. And maybe the deepest thing here is what zograio means. The calling isn't to catch people and drag them somewhere they don't want to go. It's to catch them alive, to pull them out of the water that's been drowning them and into something that gives them life. Every conversation you have, every act of kindness, every moment where you tell the truth about what God has done in the middle of your own empty nets, that's the mission. You don't need a degree or a title or a full net. You need the willingness to say, "At your word, I'll try again." The sun was fully up over the Sea of Galilee. That morning, Simon Peter left everything and followed a carpenter who knew nothing about fishing, but everything about what an empty net was for. 2 boats full of fish sat on the shore behind him, the biggest haul of his career. And he walked away from it without looking back, because the catch was never the point. The catch was just how he met the one who would give him a life worth catching.